Okay.
Yay.
All right. Very good. So this presentation tonight, we're going to take about 30, 40 minutes, a little bit longer, and they have some time for some Q&A about what happens between the 1st of September 1939 through to Sedan and the Battle of Stonne shortly thereafter um, when it comes to armor battles during the Battle of France. The first piece of this is really kind of understanding what goes on in September of 39. Fallweiss is its own interesting story. This is a period German map that shows you roughly what the campaign looks like from the German point of view, without some of the latter interventions following the 17th when the Soviets invade from the east. This is kind of the initial plan of operations and how things plan out through the initial German operation. Now, here are some of the problems with the Polish defense. Just to give a very thin overview of this campaign, which is really interesting. The Polish defense is too far forward. They've got one strong line basically with very little depth to it. The Poles are overmatched in armor and aircraft, both in quantity and quality in general. They have a few modern airplanes. Most of them are older. Most of the Polish tanks are quite old. They're on a par with a lot of the tanks in places like Hungary and Romania at the time. They're made out of kits, or they're older tanks they've tried to upgrade. The Poles have some leftover FTs from World War One that have been slightly modernized, etc. Polish doctrine and tactics, again, clearly outmatched by the Germans. Overall, they're really mostly outnumbered most of the places they're going to fight. And the one thing that really puts the nail in the coffin for the Poles, really looking at a lot of the other issues concerns the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret provisions of the pact that where the Soviets will invade Poland from the east on the 17th, about 2.5 weeks after the Germans have conducted the initial invasion. Now, Poland is overrun fairly quickly. It's not that the Poles don't fight fiercely, they do, but they aren't capable of matching the pace of the German attack. They aren't capable of really dealing with some of the more difficult aspects of the German attack, especially the aerial assaults. And they aren't really able to cope with the combined arms efforts of the German. Rudimentary, though they really kind of are in September of 39 during Poland, because the Germans are kind of working through some of the problems, some of the ideas that they've trained on, but really never put into action, even considering some of the material they've garnered from places like the Spanish Civil War. Now, the German reaction to Poland is this: to tweak, adjust, plan, and build. So one of the things that they sort out is they work a little bit with the Fliegerverbindungsoffizier, the air ground coordination. They start to tweak that model a little bit. Some of the adjustments that they make, especially with armor tactics early on the battlefield for the first time, again, slight modifications, not drastic. Planning for the invasion of France, which there are multiple plans for, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and then building to create the logistic setup so they can fight the Battle of France. Because the one thing that's really on the mind of especially the German generals at the time, who are all World War One veterans, is how hard the fight was in France in World War One, and they're not going into this thinking this is going to be a pushover. As a matter of fact, the German generals are quite nervous about the invasion of France, and there is a lot of apprehension. They remember what the Western Front was like, and they fully understand that after September 3rd, they're fighting the British as well. So this puts a really tough dynamic on them, something that they have to consider very carefully how to overcome, no matter how ambitious Hitler is. The armor program, sorry, I'm wrestling with the aftermath of a cold. The expansions, there's expansions to build more Panzer IIIs and more Panzer IVs. The Panzer Is and Panzer IIs are known to be obsolete by the time, but they're still going to be a mainstay of the invasion of France in 1940. Matter of fact, there'll be far more Panzer Is and Panzer IIs and Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Some of the Panzer IIIs are not upgraded to 50 millimeter guns by the time they invade France. A lot of them, in fact, still have 37 millimeter guns. And the number of Panzer IVs is quite limited. The French reaction. The French reaction to Poland is interesting, and I don't want to use the word panic because I think it's an ill-placed word. But the French start having very strong second thoughts, especially higher command echelons in France. Gamelin, in particular, had been very reluctant to create modern mechanized formations, and he had fought tooth and nail with many of the innovators in the French army during the last part of the 1930s. The French military academic press, which had been vibrant, really, honestly, if you really want to read some excellent material in the interwar period about the possibilities for future war, start digging into the French interwar military journals because they're producing excellent material. They're also producing some rather ridiculous material. There's a really famous quote from a French officer, I think in 1936, that says that, well, we won't have to worry about defending ourselves against German airplanes because we'll simply hear them before they get there. On the other hand, you've got some really forward thinking work on how to best utilize tanks, the role of air power in combined operations, and even the role of relatively new units like airborne units. The French experiment with airborne in 1937, another really long and interesting story that deserves its own talk sometime. One of the things that France does is finally, to almost right before the invasion of Poland, you start to see them create armored units. So basically, the DCCs, the light cavalry units, is what they're calling them. Okay, and these really equate to armor divisions. There are going to be 6 of them created between the 22nd of August 1939 and March of 1940. The 6th one, though, is going to be in North Africa. It's really not going to play any part in this. But it's taking until immediately before the invasion of Poland before they create them at all. And it's by this point, there's not, they've got basically, by the time they create the division on paper and then create the division in fact and then put the division in the field, they've got less than 6 months to actually create a working training model for this division. They are going to increase production. So production of aircraft, production of tanks, infantry weapons, anti-tank weapons, which anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons are going to be a serious problem for France. They're going to have some very effective ones, actually. They have a remarkably effective 25 millimeter anti-tank weapon / anti-aircraft weapon, but they can't produce enough of them. They have a pretty good 47 millimeter anti-tank gun. But again, its production is a problem. And France encounters a really interesting problem during this period, which even when it can produce the weapons it needs and the production is increasing all the time, what it isn't doing effectively, really between, let's say, December of 39 and June of 1940, is it's not able to train the large number of reservists that France is going to rely on to use these effectively in the roles for which they will be intended, especially in the anti-aircraft role. And this is going to come into play again in this presentation fairly shortly at Sedan in particular. The French mobilized very successfully. The mobilization goes somewhat smoothly in September of 39, except the French don't pay very close attention to how they mobilize, and their mobilization plans are actually going to cause some production problems down the road, because instead of prioritizing certain professions, let's say machinists in particular, and saying, okay, well, you don't need to report because you're much more useful, making propeller shafts or making breeches for tank guns or something like that, they kind of mobilize haphazardly, and they have to start going back in October, November, and sorting back through these reservists who've already been drawn up and putting some of them back in the factories because some of the people they pull out are vital to production. My pet project, of course, the French Air Force. They're still very wary of their Air Force for political reasons. They've created a big problem because they don't want to use radios. We talked about that in the last session. I can address that. I'll address that a little bit more as we go along because it has some bearing. And there's still a large belief amongst the French command that the Germans are going to conform to what the French think they will do. And they really think they're going to get Schlieffen Part 2. And that's the way they are planning. Now, the planning, of course, is grossly complicated by the Belgian problem, with Belgium returning neutrality, and then France and Britain having to find a way to plan theoretically without Belgium being directly involved, and Belgium kind of, setting on the fence and him hauling around about it to the last minute. And then finally, when it's obvious that things are going to go south, working with the French and British, but by that point it's far too late, and it creates a lot of operational complications later on in the campaign. Then, of course, we have the famous incident, where the Mechelen incident, where the German plans for the invasion of France are captured because the light reconnaissance aircraft, or light liaison aircraft that the plans are being carried in, which was absolutely forbidden, crashes inside of friendly territory. And although the pilot and the staff officer in charge do try to destroy the plans in a little wood stove in the building in which they're being held, they're discovered, the plans are pulled out. And what they find when they reveal the plans is that, hey, the French High Command was right. This does look an awful lot like, not exactly like, but this looks a little bit like Schlieffen Part 2. So there is some reinforcement in the belief that the Germans will, of course, do the same thing the same way again, which they don't, which leads us to von Manstein's plan. Now, there's been a lot of ink spilled over this debate over, was this von Manstein's plan? Halder takes credit for it. Hitler takes credit for it. What really is this? Okay. In reality, the evidence points firmly to the fact this was von Manstein's idea. We can argue all day long about, who is the best, or who are the best generals of World War II. Von Manstein objectively comes up as a very good general. He has his faults, like all generals do. He inflates his own self-worth and lost victories, which is a bit of a propaganda effort on his part, but the man's very competent. He has very good ideas, and this does seem to be largely his design. The bulk of von Manstein's, or really the hinge point is attacking through the Ardennes in quote-unquote terrible or impassable terrain, and it's kind of a counter Schlieffen plan. So instead of hooking around and going to the south and threatening Paris, it's hooking north through the Ardennes, where they shouldn't be able to get through, going north and then splitting the Allied army and then pinning the bulk of the best British and French divisions and most of the French armor up against the coast, which we all know ex post facto happens. Von Manstein's plan is only adopted after the incident with the original plans. Manstein had been a little too big for his britches, so to speak, in the eyes of many of the German general staff. He was bright, and he knew it, and he was bright and they knew it, and he spoke out a little bit too often, and they farmed him out until he managed to squeak his plan through the chain and get it looked at and eventually approved for adoption, that what will become Fall Gelb. Now, on 10 May, what we have is that the Germans are going to open their invasion of the Low Countries and France. And it turns out the Ardennes was actually a very tough place to move through. We often think, or we often hear about the fact that the Germans come storming through the Ardennes into Allied territory, and it is this breakthrough in an area that was thought that nobody could go through that really is one of the hinge points of the operation. Now, this is true, but they're not going to get through this area unnoticed, and they're not going to get through this area without problems. In fact, as soon as the Germans move into these areas, French aircraft spot stalled German columns. They're sitting there, 20 miles worth of stalled German columns that are actually stuck on these terrible little roads through the Ardennes. And the French reconnaissance pilots report this back to French High Command. Hey, there are miles of German vehicles piled up in the Ardennes. We need to bomb them. There's lightly defended. There's not much they can do. They're stuck on one road. They're at our mercy. And the French command returns, no, do not bomb them, because they're afraid of the repercussions, of the possibility that the bombs may do damage to civilians. And this is a carryover of a very old French fear from World War I, which I covered in my book, about strategic bombing, that the French are terrified, even in World War II, that if they conduct strategic bombing in any form against the Germans will return the favor in kind, but tenfold. And in the French mind, considering the very sensitive nature of the politics and society in France, they think that morale bombing in France could seriously be a problem and could create more internal strife than they already have. So even though there is a solid argument, and this is counterfactual, we all know how that is, that the campaign could have turned out quite differently if the French and British had thrown everything they had at those stalled German columns that they spotted and knew were there in the Ardennes. They simply didn't. It's when they emerge from the Ardennes that the real chaos of this plan will begin. Now, the breakthrough is going to be mostly through Army Group A, 4th, 12th, and 16th Armies. 7 Panzer divisions will be in this group. Now, keep this in mind. One thing that I think is very important that a lot of people ignore, a big difference between the early war and the later war periods with Panzer divisions. Each one of these Panzer divisions in 1940 has roughly 300 tanks each. That is a lot of tanks. By the time you start getting to the mid-war period, the Germans are going to start whittling down and whittling down and whittling down the number of tanks in a Panzer division. And many people's expectations of what a Panzer division can and cannot do is going to be built upon what a Panzer division could and could not do in 1940 with 300 tanks, right about. Now, of course, nobody's table of organization equipment is going to ever be full at full power. And there's always going to be tanks that are broken down for maintenance, or they're not going to have replacements, or they're not going to have quite the full complement or whatever. But most of these Panzer divisions are going to have between 260 or so and about 300 tanks. And that is a tremendous amount of mechanized power on a very small scale in a very small area. And that's part of the success that we're going to see with what they do, especially after we get past Sedan and we get past Stonne. Now, Sedan is a known sensitive point. There had been battles there before. There's a famous battle there fought in 1870. There are 3 Panzer divisions headed for Sedan on the Meuse as part of Army Group A. And the Infantry Regiment Grossdeutschland is also going to be there. Now, GD is going to evolve into a Panzer Corps by the end of the war. It's going to have a pretty storied reputation as a division, as an elite division. But it's not a division yet. These battles at Sedan and Stonne are where GD is going to begin to build its reputation. It's one of my other little pet projects is working with the history of that division. So we're only going to be realistically there are going to be 2 units primarily defending the Stonne area the Sedan area for France. The first is the 55th Infantry Division, and the second is the 147th Fortress Infantry Regiment. These are not, again, the 55th is a Category B unit. They're generally older soldiers. Most of them are 30, 35 or older. Their standard of training is not that great. The 147th Fortress Infantry Regiment, again, is not a really considered like a Category A unit. They don't really train that way. The Fortress Infantry Regiments are designed to fight from fixed and static positions. They aren't really trained to fight wars of maneuver. And neither of these units is really trained up to the level that it should be for the combat that both are getting ready to endure at Sedan. The 55th, for instance, one of the really interesting facts about that is many of their troops had never even thrown a live hand grenade. And right before the invasion starts, they're looking at these deficiencies and problems and beginning to think, well, gee, maybe this is something we should fix. But they are in a position that they think they will be safe. Nobody expects, and this is a truth. Nobody expects that the Germans are going to be at Sedan anytime soon, and that's part of the reason that these units are there. They're there kind of as a safety net, but they're also there with full knowledge of the fact that these are not really, frontline divisions, but with the thought that they might not have to fight the Germans, and certainly not have to fight the Germans without support. Somebody could get there in time, but that they could be a good stopgap if needs be. Now, problems with the French defenses. Low level of training. We kind of addressed that. Older troops. Most of these troops are going to be older. They're not going to be 18, 20, 25-year-old troops. Most of them are going to be 30, 35 or older. And the levels of training with the Fortress Infantry regiments and the reserve regiments are never where they should be. The French never really train the reserves up in the 30s to the level that they want to. They recognize it's a problem, but they never seem to get their act together to train these divisions to the level they should have been. They have fewer anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, but really what comes out of this as well, when you really look at the problem at the core, is that the training to use them is not there. And they also don't have very good training when it comes to understanding how aircraft work. And they don't understand that they can defend themselves. They don't understand that there's good ways to avoid being killed or damaged or have your equipment damaged when the aircraft attack you. And they don't have any practical experience of this in the field. So again, this is a big shortcoming. Poor communications because of the radio problem we've mentioned previously. And the other big problem we're going to have at Sedan is the fact that when the British and the French do commit air attacks against the bridges, the bridges and the pontoon bridges that the Germans are going to throw across the Meuse, they're going to be futile air attacks that are not well organized. And one of the things they are going to encounter is German units that are very well prepared to defend themselves against air attack. They're very familiar with how to do it, with weapons going all the way from, not every German machine gun, but at the company level, at least one or two anti-aircraft tripods would be available for the light machine guns like the MG-34. There were other flak guns, 20 millimeter, 37 millimeter, all the way up to 88 millimeter that were traveling with these divisions that knew their job and knew how to use this well. And when the French and British air attacks finally do come in, they're not going to do much good. They're going to be extremely costly. Now, this is in contrast to the French units that don't have as many anti-aircraft weapons as they should have and very little training to use them otherwise. Another factor that really needs to be discussed with this, and this is one of the things that in popular kind of the popular mindset and a lot of popular works, you don't really see a lot of emphasis on, is that Sedan and Stonne in particular, these are combined arms efforts. This is not just German tanks rolling up to a river, running across a bridge, and then heading off into the French countryside. These are going to be really hard-fought engagements. Now, that's something to consider, too. We're looking at French units, especially at Sedan in the beginning, that don't really have the level of training they have. They're still going to put up a serious fight. They're not going to be able to resist it, but they do put up a tough fight against very well-trained and very well-equipped Germans at this point. But it's not just the tanks. It's the combat engineers that are putting the bridges up. It's the combat engineers that are crossing the river in little rubber dinghies with flamethrowers and satchel charges and blowing up French machine gun emplacements. It's the infantry and the artillery. It's the air power that is going to come to play. And all of this together is going to create the victory at Sedan and eventually at Stonne. It's not going to be just, German tanks storming across the bridge and trundling off in the French countryside, and that is it. Because this is going to be a very tough crossing. It's going to be tough to maintain the pontoon bridges. It's going to be tough to get the spots on the French side of the river to start putting the pontoons up, and then to maintain these under heavy French defense and counterattacks is also going to be quite challenging. Now, at Sedan is eventually going to fall. Sedan's a fairly short battle, only in a couple of days that the French are going to be able to hold on there. And for instance, when the German aerial attacks do come, when the Luftwaffe comes and attacks things, one of the things that's noticed after the battle is it's the psychological effect of the air attacks that really is kind of traumatic on the French defenders. When they go through after the battle is over, one of the things they find is that the Luftwaffe attacks really didn't damage all that much. Tore up the phone lines really well, which created a problem because you can't use the radio. Did some damage to French emplacements, etc., but not that much. That really the psychological factor was worse than the physical factor. But once the French figure out what's going on at Sedan, how big a threat this is, they're going to conduct really probably the first really good effective counterattack they're going to have during the Battle of France. They realize the critical nature of the problem, and Stonne, which is a tiny little village, actually is going to become the focal point of the counterattack once the Germans are trundling out of Sedan and starting to head and threaten the French interior. It's a relatively poorly known and studied battle. And this is where GD, and again with at Sedan, starts to really earn its title as an elite unit. It does a lot of heavy fighting in both these engagements and starts to get the attention of the German command at this point. It's the battle at Stonne that probably is going to get GD expanded immediately after this, and then earn it the reputation it gets. A lot of headlines in the papers, newsreels, that sort of thing. Stonne is fought over the course of the 14th to 17th of May. One of the things that Stonne really does is prove that this is not a headlong French retreat. This village changes hands 17 times during the course of these days. There are German veterans who supposedly compare the fighting at Stonne to engagements that they later fought in places like Kharkov and Stalingrad and places like that, and saying the fighting at Stonne for the days that it lasted, and it's not saying at all that this battle is going to be the intensity or length of Stalingrad, it was just as fierce. According to the French, some French sources call this the Verdun of World War II. But again, this is probably the hardest fought battle of the entire campaign. But what do we get out of this battle when it comes to tank battles in May of 1940 and June 1940? One of the things we figure out at this battle, and one of the things you can derive from this, is that when it comes to French tanks fighting German tanks on the battlefield, when it's a head-to-head encounter, this is not going to be a lopsided German victory, ever. And Stonne is really one of the best places you can see that. There's a French captain named Pierre Bellot, who later goes on to be the French military attaché to the UN, and then eventually, toward the end of his career, he actually is the defense minister in France. He was leading a company of French tanks, the Char B1, and what he does at Stonne really creates the model for every heavy tank attack with a well-trained crew thereafter. Destroys 13 German tanks in one day. The first victims he encounters is a column of 7 German Panzer IIIs, all armed with a 37 millimeter gun. The Germans unleash a hail of fire on his tank, but it's all very ineffective. It bounces off. His tank is hit, according to most sources, over 140 times during the course of the battle on the 16th. He knocks out the first Panzer III in the column, knocks out the last Panzer III in the column, and then works his way to the middle and knocks out the rest. Now, he knocks out the first tank in the column. The Char B1 has a sponson gun, a hull-mounted gun, not really a sponson gun, that French sergeant is operating, knocks out the last tank in the column, and then they work together toward the middle to knock those out. Later on in the day, through the course of assaulting through the village, he's going to knock out 6 more German tanks and I think 2 more anti-tank guns during that point. The Germans are going to take really tremendous losses, especially on the 16th, because these French tanks and their very well-trained crews, especially on a tactical level when they're facing the Germans head-on, this is a head-on-head engagement, are very capable of fighting the Germans. Not only are their tanks better, but the standard of training and the quality of the troops is actually quite high. The French armored troops are going to be some of the better soldiers that are going to be recruited in the French army, some of the better conscripts, and they're going to be a technical field. They're going to have appeal just like they do in the German army. And what you see is the quality of the equipment and the quality of training is very capable of dealing with the German threat on this level. And that's really kind of the thing to keep in mind. The German 37 millimeter gun is not effective against the B1. It's not effective against several of the other French tanks. You know, the Germans call it the door knocker, especially in Russia, supposedly because it's ineffective against T-34. Well, it was ineffective against the Char B1 and other French tanks before it was ineffective against T-34. In a close fight where broad level communications, coordination, resupply are not an issue, the French are able to triumph in a tank-on-tank engagement. Now, look, these are not Panzer 1s and 2s. These are Panzer 3s and 4s. These are the best tanks the Germans have at the time. And the French are beating them soundly. Okay, so this is not a walkover at all. Now, what do you get out of this? And why is this important? What Sedan and Stonne do together is that they prove that this is not as lopsided as we have perceived it. The perceptions of the battle, especially after World War II, and there are political things going on with this. There are all sorts of nationalistic issues going on here. It's just not, these battles aren't really carefully examined to the point that they should be to really look at what happened and what goes on. This is a combined arms effort on the German part that really claims the victory here. These panzers are not, medieval knights just riding down hordes of French peasants, which is kind of what the impression you get lots of times on popular media documentaries, some books that have been written, that sort of thing. That, these tanks aren't going to be able to do their job without the German combat engineers, without the German infantry, without the German artillery, without the German aircraft. It's this combined whole that's really effective for them. And the standard of training and equipment amongst these frontline German infantry and engineer units and artillery units is quite high. So the Germans at Sedan are putting the best they have up against basically second line, not that they're not fighting hard in the beginning, French reserve units. And then when they get into Stonne, they're running into first line French units that are quite capable and just as well trained and better equipped than they are in many cases. Now, with problems, admittedly, but still. One of the other big issues that comes out of this that is never emphasized enough is when the French and the British do finally commit to aerial attacks against this German bridgehead that's coming across at Sedan. The attacks aren't well coordinated. They're not well designed. They're extremely costly, and it proves that well-equipped, well-trained ground troops with anti-aircraft guns, effective anti-aircraft weapons, are very capable of defending themselves, and they can be devastating, especially to a poorly planned and coordinated air attack. One of the other things we derive from this, again, looking at this first engagement between German tanks and French tanks and German combined arms and French infantry, taking everything as a whole, is that some of these French problems are fundamental. We've got the communication issue, the training of reserve troops, on which so much depends in France. There are many reserve German units in the fight as well, but the standard of training, again, it is kind of the issue. France is not, in many ways, bringing its reserve troops up to the capacity that they should have been. I mean, if you've got troops that have never even thrown a hand grenade in a reserve unit, or at least haven't done it for 15 or 20 years, you've got some serious issues. If you're not even able to manipulate your standard infantry weapons, and you haven't had any aircraft training, or that sort of a thing, that's going to create big problems, and it does. But even with all the disadvantages, it's not a walk in the park. Again, Stonne changes hands 17 times. This is not going to be a walkover. And when the French are in a position where they can put up an effective defense on the spot with good units and good troops, they do a very good job of it. French tankers themselves are quite competent. French regular troops are quite competent, but the problems are still daunting. The bigger problems they're going to have, issues that they don't have now that we're going to see in the next episodes, are going to be extremely problematic and are really honestly going to be the source of much of the French and British defeat in armor battles in May and June of 1940. But the other thing we're going to see is that modern French tanks are more than a match. As a matter of fact, in many ways, when it comes to the toughness of the tank, the armor of the tank, the guns on the tank, they're better. The big problem is they don't have a radio. Now, there's some other logistical issues that we'll get into as well in the subsequent discussions. But when it comes to being able to fight them on the spot without some logistic concerns and without large scale communication concerns, they are able to defeat the Germans and actually defeat them quite soundly. But the Germans are still successful. And these are really kind of the core lessons that you get out of looking at what's happening between the 10th and the 17th of May, between the German crossing at Sedan and the conclusion of the battle at Stonne. If you are interested, here are some books that were used during the I used as a reference when we're putting this presentation together. This is not complete. Some of these are rather old school. Alistair Horn's book is kind of, quote unquote, the classic. There are problems with Horn's book, obviously, but it's what a lot of people cut their teeth on reading about the Battle of France. Martin Alexander's book is fantastic, looking at the way that the French command thought about problems, especially Gamelin thought about the potential for World War II and the lead up to it. Brian Bond does an excellent discussion on the problem that is created between France and Belgium with Belgium's return to neutrality. Mark Bloch's is a classic primary source that, written from the inside, there's a lot of stuff that Bloch doesn't witness, but at least gives you kind of a feel for what many French soldiers were thinking during the battle. Bob Cetino's book, The Path to Blitzkrieg, is obviously excellent. Doughty's books are the best, really, in a lot of ways, understanding what the problems of the Siege of Disaster is, the concerns, the problems of the French army leading up to World War II. And the breaking point is, in my opinion, the best book you will ever read up to this that's available right now in the Battle of Sedan and World War II. Freester's The Blitzkrieg Legend is a good book, has some issues with it, especially when you talk about air power, but it's a good solid reassessment, especially looking at the German perspective on the invasion and some of the concerns and criticism and critiques that we don't often get exposed to, at least until recently. Elizabeth Keir book, also good, looking at French doctrine in the pre-war period, and Zetterling's book, Blitzkrieg from the Ground Up, is a really good discussion on a lot of levels from again, looking at German doctrine, et cetera. There's more than this, but these were the books that were largely consulted for facts and details on this presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take.
Well, questions, anyone? All right. Well, I got a couple of comments I'll make. Of course, my focus on this was at one point I was working on a book called Understanding World War II with Nicholas Zetterling as the co-author. So we ended up stopping on that book, and it's sitting on my computer, 2/3 written, and at some point I may get around to finishing it. But one of the things I ended up doing was just looking at um, um, what it took to take out a bridge. And of course, the example I had was from Kursk, where the Germans put a whole bunch of bridges across in July 43 across the Donetsk River, and then the entire most of the 17th Air Army for several days tried to take them down, and never took a single one down. And so, in July 43, the Soviet Air Force could not take out a German bridge. Needless to say, some of the accounts tend to criticize the French and British efforts to take out the bridge at Sedan. And quite simply, it's very hard to take down a bridge. And so I ended up addressing that to some extent, because it's people have always criticized the British and the German airs for not taking out the bridge, but it's a hard thing to do. Especially in the 1940s.
Yes.
Clinton, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just had a interest in the radios. The use of I gather from what you're saying, the French didn't have radios and the Germans did. And I just wondered if you could give me a bit of an expansion on that, particularly how the Germans actually use their radio in coordination.
Okay. I'll go into the. Let me give you a brief overview of that. I'll go into more detail on that in the next session in a couple of weeks. But here's the big problem with French armored attacks is going to be the same problem with French aerial attacks. If you're not able to use a radio, you can't really communicate effectively quickly enough to keep pace with the Germans. That's the big issue. Okay. The Germans are able, one of the things that makes German tanks so effective is the fact that they're able to communicate with each other on a tactical level and an operational level. And they're able to coordinate their movements and keep the pace of battle going faster than the French and the British can react to them. And that's really what the radio does, is it gives them the ability, in a way, to see and move over large distances quickly, which you can't do with couriers or you can't do with a telephone line. When the French units that are defending Sedan, the I want to call it the Festums, the fortress unit that's defending Sedan and the infantry division defending Sedan, they're using telephone lines and they're using field telephone lines. They're not even using the radios. The French tanks don't have radios on them. A lot of French units that actually have an Air Force squadron kind of assigned to them because the French army broke the Air Force up into dozens of little pieces from a very good organization. They have no way to communicate with the pilots. You're dealing with the French army probably, in some ways, probably had better radio communications in 1940 than it did in 1940. It's not they didn't have good radios. It's that they just didn't use them. And the big issue is that if you can't use a radio, you can't coordinate a fast-moving attack or a fast-moving defense over any sort of a distance, especially when your enemy does have them. And that's where the radio becomes a really key point, not only in the armored battles that are occurring in 1940, but in the aerial battles that are occurring in 1940.
Okay, that's good. So I guess you could summarize it by saying it's adaptability. If you've got the radio, you can adapt to the changing conditions and changing behavior of the enemy. If you don't, then you're stuck with more or less with your original plan, and you can't really adapt it very quickly or very well.
It's exactly right. And the French are always, again, when the French can fight, look at Stonne, when the French can grapple, when the good French unit can grapple with a good German unit, they can beat them. They can fight effectively. But when it comes to actually, and this will become more apparent in the next presentation, when it comes to actually being able to maneuver large units and react to large German movements, it's very difficult for them to do. And virtually the entire cause for that is the lack of radio communication.
Can you just let me get one thing straight? The Germans do have radios and use them. The French do have radios but do not use them. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. You have to, the way that the French had radios, but you had to request permission from higher command to use the radios. So, for instance, if you're a lieutenant or a captain and you want to use the radio to reach out to, for instance, your regiment or brigade or division, you've got to actually request permission from the officer above you to use the radio, and many times he has to request permission to use the radio. And this all stems from poor communication security in World War I and the French reaction to that, which is to rely on other forms of communication rather than the radio after World War I. Whereas the British, the French, the British, the Germans, the Americans, and the Japanese all say, hey, this is a great tool. We've just got to figure out a way to make it more secure. The French continue to develop radios and use them a lot during the interwar period. But when it comes to fighting the Germans, they're very hesitant to use them at all. And there's a weighty process that has to be followed most of the time if you actually even want to use the radio. So, again, it's extremely problematic. And from a surface level view, it doesn't make sense at all. But you have to understand from their point of view, they felt that the communication security was such a problem that using the radio was actually a detriment most of the time.
Okay, thank you.
Dimitri.
Yeah, I would like to ask for book recommendations for a single book for amateur like me who doesn't want to read 800 pages books and something on the, what will you recommend around kind of a decent book from all this list?
Well, if you probably Freezer's book is very readable. It's not too dense. It's easy to follow. I have some complaints with it, but it's a good book. And it covers a lot of the key details that don't get covered in other books about the Battle of France. And the research is very thorough. His conclusions are pretty sound. My big problems with Freezer's book, though, come back to the French Air Force. But the French Air Force is really one of my big pet projects, and a lot of people really just have never tackled it that well. I would start there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yvonne.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of circle back just real quick to or on the topic of communication. And I know you said that you're going to probably expound more on this in the next part of this series. But I was just curious if you just make this just kind of maybe provide a little bit more background on when you mentioned, you know, some of the thinking that was going on during interwar years, right? With the French army. How really were then they kind of conceptualizing if like they weren't, if, you know, they felt that, hey, you know, radio communications was so problematic.
Okay.
How then were they really trying to conceptualize controlling large scale forces in that, type of environment?
Okay. What's going on with France is that the French, especially Gamelin and his compatriots, are very committed to the idea of bataille composée, which is composed battle, or basically it's a very controlled. Another word for it is methodical battle. The French wanted to control the entire battle from the very top down, and the system that they had implemented for this was motorcycle couriers, land telephone lines, and field telephones. They had very good experiences in the interwar period using radio communications, for instance, in the Rif War. But the fear, again, predicated upon the experiences in World War I, was that the radio would actually be more of a detriment than effective. If you are approaching this from the French mindset, that this methodical battle mindset, that the battle can be controlled from a top-down manner, from the Chateau de Vincennes outside of Paris all the way to the front lines. It can be controlled from Paris via couriers and via telephone lines. And from that mindset, if you can fight the battle that way, it makes sense. They don't look at this as, they don't think this is going to be a particularly fast moving battle. They think this is going to be a grind. They think this is going to be a grind with modern weapons. There will be a mobile component to it, but they are convinced that that mobile component will be in the north, in and around the area of Belgium in particular. Okay. So if your outlook is that the battle is going to conform to the belief that you have it's going to conform to, and that your methodical battle concepts where you will be able to control every aspect of this battle from the very top down, then it works. But this kind of comes back to the old adage about the enemy gets a vote too. And the Germans had no intentions of really fighting the battle that way, especially when it comes to, Fall Gelb and the Manstein plan.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Clinton, you got your hand back up.
Yes. I just wondered, was back on the radio issue, was it something that the Germans did that made their radio communications more secure, or was it just administrative that they did allow communication?
Just codes. Basically, there at a certain level, there would have been Enigma devices available. I'm trying to think of what the distribution of those is. I'll try to look and see for you. I can't recall off the top of my head. At the division level, there are probably going to be at least one or two Enigma devices. But when it comes to tactical communications, for instance, which really was some of the biggest problems with the French communications in World War One, it's going to be basic, just codes. You're going to have code names or code words for different tanks in the platoon or different tanks in the company, or the company's going to have a code name and the battalion will have a code name, like we do with Red 6, Red 4, Red 5, Red 1. And the other thing too that was really interesting, and I thought this was of note, that the German tank crews, I was listening to an interview of a German tank crewman that was recorded, probably 40 years ago at this point. And one of the things that really stood out was that he said that the radios were so good and the headsets were so good that when they spoke to each other, they didn't even have to ask who was speaking. It was clear enough that they understood who was there. They could just recognize each other's voices. So, that's a familiarity issue too. But what you end up with is they're used to using them, which is one thing. They're effective and they're good radios, which is another. And they've practiced this. They've trained to use the radio this way. The British did a really good job of it in the late 20s and early 30s when they're practicing a lot in Salisbury Plain. When Hobart is out there with them running circles around some of these other units that he's training against, what it comes down to is they're just using the radio. They're able to communicate effectively, especially in coordination with things like good maps, and they're able to take advantage of that overmatch, really, in communications and speed to create a situation that the enemy finds very difficult to deal with. And this is what France is going to have to deal with from the 10th of May all the way to the 16th of June.
Okay, thanks. That's good. That's a unique insight. I haven't come across this issue with the radios with anyone else, so thank you for that insight.
Thank you.
Anyone else got questions? Anyone got comments?
I have a comment, Chris. Jamie, Professor Slaughter, I just want to thank you for another exceptional presentation. I always look forward to you when you present, whether it be 3D or on Zoom. And thank you for this, just very solid, dense, quality presentation.
Thank you, Joe.
All right. Thank
I'll
you,
say
Joe.
the same thing. I missed the first presentation because I had to work that night, but I really did appreciate this one, and I look forward to the next one.
Oh, thank you. I'm enjoying these.
Me too.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and then you guys can say whatever you really, really want to say.